Chapter 6, the integumentary system. The functions of the skin is, for the most part, a protective covering. That's the number one function of the skin, is for protection. It aids in the regulation of body temperature, as we saw in Chapter 1. It communicates with the central nervous system with receptors, letting the brain know of our environment, heat, hot and cold, pain, pressure, etc. It helps to synthesize or make various chemicals. One example would be vitamin D. It takes the UV radiation as you are exposed to sunlight and helps the skin to produce vitamin D, which helps with bone health. So everybody needs a little bit of exposure to UV radiation. It has a slight excretory function, though it doesn't play a major role in the excretory system. And it has cells found within the skin that help fight off invading organisms, so you have an immune response when there is an infection going on. It contains about 10% of the body's blood vessels, about 10%. Also makes up about 7% of the body mass in adults. Again, the primary function is protection. The structure, you see this upper layer here, where this undulated tissue is on up, is the epidermis. The dermis is from here to here, where this yellow is, and then where the adipose tissue is, and deeper, the subcutaneous layer. Now the subcutaneous layer is also called the hypodermis. It is not a true layer of skin. The epidermis is the outermost layer of skin. It is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. Epithelial cells are tightly packed cells, so they are good, effective protective barriers. They also form linings like in the mouth and tubes and coverings because they're so tightly packed. They also play a minor role in secretion, absorption, and excretion. But stratified means that it is layered, more than one layer of cells, and you can see that very easily. Squamous start out pretty round, but as they're pushed up to the top, several things happen. They're alive closer to the basement membrane here, where you have mitosis or cell division going on, and as they're pushed up, they die and become more flattened. So that flattened, this term here, tells the shape of the cell, and that would be a flattened cell. So many layers of flattened epithelial cells, epithelium. The epidermis here lacks blood vessels. No blood vessels are found here. Now, there are pain receptors. There are hot and cold receptors so that you can feel when the water that's coming out of the faucet is a little bit too warm because the hot and cold receptors in the epidermis. And also when you get a paper cut, you know it really hurts. But what's interesting is that if it's not a real deep paper cut, it doesn't bleed because this area of the skin lacks blood vessels. It grows from the stratum basal, and it contains melanocytes. Melanocytes produce melanin. Melanin gives the color to the skin. Keratinize. These cells that are dying, being pushed up from this basement membrane, where they're alive and undergoing mitosis as they're pushed up from layer after layer, they die. They become keratinocytes, which have keratin in them, a protein that makes the cell tougher and waterproof. So this epidermis forms a layer that keeps your fluids from oozing out. So the cells become keratinized with the protein keratin. The thickest part of the epidermis is on the palms and the soles of the feet. Now a dime has a dime has the thickness of about 1 millimeter. Well, if you take about 1.5 millimeters, 1.4 is about 1.5 millimeters, 1.5 thicknesses of that dime, almost 1 here, so 8/10 of the thickness of the dime to 1.4 is how thick the skin, the epidermis, can be on the palms and soles of the feet. The layers of the epidermis, you had the stratum corneum and the stratum basal with transitional layers in between. These are the 2 layers you'll need to remember. The stratum corneum is dead, keratinized skin that flakes off regularly. That's why you should change your sheets often, take a shower. You're sloughing off these dead skin cells all the time, and they're being replaced from underneath very frequently. So these cells that are deeper and living in this epidermis are undergoing mitosis or cell division at a very rapid rate. So closest to the stratum basal, or basale as some say, you have this darker pink right here is the area of very rapid cell replication. Okay, then you have the spinosum and the granulosum and the lucidum. Now the lucidum is missing in the layers of the epidermis of all the areas of the skin except for the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. It has the 5 layers. All the rest of the body have 4 layers. The dermis is thicker. It goes from the basement membrane there, or that stratum basale or basal, all the way down to this adipose tissue. About 2 dimes, 1 to 2 dimes thick, or 1 to 2 millimeters thick. It has the dermal papillae that protrude up into the epidermis. And you can see in this picture here where there are blood vessels that are found in this dermal papillae. There's a couple of purposes of this. If the tissue is undulated like this, if we could stretch it all out, it'd stretch way. If we put a string along there and stretched it out, we'd find that this increases surface area. Okay, and it's also an area where these capillaries extend up into this area. We said this area, the epidermis, does not have blood vessels. The blood vessels provide nutrients for tissue and get oxygen, and have to get rid of the waste product, carbon dioxide and other waste products. So what happens between these capillaries and these living cells here is diffusion. So these things happen with the process of diffusion. Diffusion is movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So it just sort of diffuses to the epidermis. That is another reason why the higher levels toward the stratum corneum are dead cells, because the further away you get from nutrition and oxygen, the less likely that tissue is to survive. Okay? The dermis binds the epidermis to the underlying tissue, so there's connective tissue there, irregular, dense connective tissue. There are muscle cells found there, erector pili muscles. This is a smooth muscle right here. It is associated with the hair follicle, or attached to a hair follicle. It is a smooth muscle that contracts when you're cold or scared. That fight or flight mechanism, you get the goosebumps. or excited sometimes, but mainly when you're cold, it causes the goosebumps, and that is from the action of the erector pili muscle, a smooth muscle that stands that hair on end. You have hair follicles and the glands associated with the hair follicles. There's sweat glands and apocrine glands that produce sweat and other substances. You have nerves here. These yellow lines here represent nerves that run all through this tissue. And sensory receptors, we already mentioned the pain receptors, hot and cold receptors. In the dermal papilla area, there are these little receptors here are for light touch. So when you're lightly touching something, these receptors kick into action and sends a message to the brain. Deeper in the dermis are the sensory receptors that feel deep pressure. So the harder you press on your skin, these will be activated and send information to the brain. What's interesting is that these light touch receptors are deadened if you get a local anesthesia for stitches or a surgery, while you're still awake. These are deadened, but sometimes people feel pressure even though they're not feeling pain. Pain receptors are blocked. Other receptors are blocked, but they do feel pressure, so the deadening agent does not affect these deep pressure corpuscles or sensory receptors. The subcutaneous layer is also called the hypodermis. It's got loose connective tissue, helps to bind the epidermis to the upper layers. It has adipose tissue. Adiposis fat helps to insulate and provide energy. It has major blood vessels. You have more minor blood vessels here. So these maybe even some arteries and veins, arterioles up here, and capillaries up here. The skin has accessory organs. One of those would be hair follicles and those accessory organs associated with that. The hair follicles have live epidermal cells that line it. Here's the hair follicle here. Live epidermal cells. So they're undergoing mitosis to replace the worn out and dying cells. It's a tube-like depression that extends into the dermis. You have the hair root. The hair root has the keratinized cells. We talked about keratin in the epithelial cells, epidermal cells, how it makes the cells more tough and more waterproof. The hair root has these keratinized cells. It's a little bit different keratin that makes it tough, and so it won't flake off. You have the hair shaft, and as these in this area down here, this is the region of cell division, so this is the living part, and as cells are reproduced, they push up, and as they get pushed up further away from the oxygen and food and all of that, they become keratinized, and around this area there are melanocytes putting melanin in that hair to give it color. And as it's pushed up, it dies. So the hair shaft is made up of dead epithelial cells that have been keratinized. The hair papilla is this area down here, closest to the blood source, the source for nutrition and the things needed for living cells. As they're being pushed up again, the epidermal cells die. Melanin's added to give the hair color. there is an erector pili muscle associated with that hair follicle. Now the erector pili muscle again will contract. It's a smooth muscle that will contract when you're cold. It gives you goosebumps. Now the purpose of this in other mammals is to add insulation and help with insulation, keep the body warm when it needs to be insulated. But in humans, it's not really for insulation, maybe a little bit on top of the head where you lose the most of the body heat. But otherwise, it's not really for insulation because we don't have enough hair. But we do have hair because we are mammals. Now, it does help on top of the head to protect from UV radiation. Now, there are sensory receptors that are associated with this hair follicle. And these sensory receptors get activated when you have like the wind blowing the hair, or there's an insect crawling on you. The insect might be too light for the receptors here to pick up the sensation of touch. But when they touch one of these hair shafts, then it activates these receptors here, and the brain says, oh, you have an insect crawling on you, so you can take action. Okay? This hair helps to filter dust particles and things that might get into the nose, so it filters the air that comes into the nose and the ears. Nails has another, the darker the hair, the more melanin. The hair color is determined by genetics. Albinism is when the melanin is not produced, so the hair grows without the color. So we see the blonde or almost gray hair from a person, an albino, because they don't have the melanin in their skin, their hair, and even the iris of their eyes. The nails have a protective covering also. This protective covering is made up of another type of epidermal epithelial tissue that has even another kind of keratin, that protective protein added to that epithelial tissue, the epidermal tissue, and it protects the ends of our fingers. Now, associated with the hair follicles, as we saw before, are the sebaceous glands. These cells produce globulates of fatty swelling and bursting cells, resulting in a mixture of fatty material and cellular debris called sebum. They secrete sebum. So the cell itself actually bursts, and it has a fatty material that's produced, and it mixes with the cell parts and debris. And what it does, it helps to soften hair and keep the skin soft and pliable. Yes, it is the oily substance found on the surface of the skin. It differs from other sweat glands, the eccrine sweat glands, by what is secreted. Also, this is associated with a hair follicle, and other sweat glands usually are not. And these are found all over the body, except for on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. The eccrine glands or regular sweat glands are not associated with hair follicles usually. The groups of specialized epithelial cells, where the cells actually burst and part of the cell is excreted in the excretion, the fluid that's excreted. And with the excess sebum and dead cells, parts. Excess sebum is a big contributor to acne. The other type of sweat glands, here are your sebaceous glands associated with this hair follicle, produces sebum to keep the hair soft and keep the skin soft. This is an Apocrine gland. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the regular sweat gland, the eccrine sweat gland, can be found anywhere on the surface, again, except for the soles of the feet and the palms of the hands. They activate usually respond to elevated body temperature. As we said before, helps the body to cool down through evaporation. Apocrine gland is another type of gland that usually responds to emotional stress. A little bit to temperature, but more emotional stress. Now, eccrine sweat glands produce the sweat. Apocrine sweat gland, now in this picture it's associated with the hair follicle also, but it doesn't always have to be associated with the hair follicle. They're usually a little bit larger than an eccrine sweat gland and a little bit deeper. Now what's interesting about them is they do not activate until puberty. They are the glands that produce a yellowish, more viscous fluid than does the regular eccrine sweat gland. They're most numerous in the axilla, A-X-I-L-L-A. The axilla is the area of the armpits. So also a few of them are found in the genital area. They're similar in sweat glands, but with fatty substances and proteins that are given off. The fluid is more viscous or thicker and sometimes yellow. And because this is the area of the armpits, activates at puberty. And if you don't treat your white or light color shirts, it can yellow under the arm or the armpit of that shirt because of this fluid that is released. Now, it's interesting to note that the fluid that is released by the apocrine sweat gland rise in temperature, emotional stress. But this fluid is somewhat odorless. Well, but after a while it doesn't remain odorless very long. What happens is that bacteria will metabolize in this fluid, and when bacteria metabolize in it or carry on their life function, they will produce a stinky smell, that musty smell. So if you take a shower in the morning and forget to put your deodorant on, you can go part of the day and not notice. But a little bit later in the day, you will, because that bacteria has time to grow and produce the odor. Eccrine sweat gland, a little bit different, and it's found all over the body. There's no cellular material given off by this gland like the sebaceous gland. It secretes about 99% water and 1% salt and traces metabolic wastes. So we said it played a minor role, skin plays a minor role in the excretory system, and this is how things are excreted. But like I said before, it's a very minor role, very small percent, and not a whole lot. It's regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, so we have little control over our sweating. It will respond in emotional situations, fight or flight. Fight or flight is the sympathetic nervous system. stress, fight or flight. You either run away or you fight. Nervousness. Most are found on the forehead, the neck, and the back. The main function of a regular sweat gland, eccrine sweat gland, is thermoregulation, maintaining body temperature. The sweat cools the body down. As the sweat evaporates, it draws the heat out to the environment and cools the body down. It responds primarily to elevated body temperatures. The apocrine gland, I said a few are found in the genital area. Some think that they're there, maybe related to sexual scent glands. Other appendages of the skin, mammillary glands produce milk. The cereminous glands, mammary glands in the breast, produce milk as their main function. Cereminous glands produce earwax. And this slide probably looks familiar. And we're going to start that in the next section as we review what happens with regulation of body temperature.